technological advancements. I know wind tunnel, we just saw a presentation with all those large facades, and none of which perhaps would have been possible if these kind of technologies were not available to, allow those kind of buildings to be built and sustained. Ideas of fire safety, and not just fire safety, but all kinds of compliances that we will now, gradually adhere to in any of the buildings we design, which are also in a way transforming the way architecture gets created. I mean, sometimes not necessarily for the better, where our compliances in fact almost don't allow us to make verandas in buildings or make courtyards in buildings because they all get counted in a built-up area, and it transforms the way our architecture gets created. And we want to look at the cities today and see, whether we're doing the right thing. But we perhaps have something outside of architecture that's, sort of boxed us into doing something which may not necessarily be the natural thing that we should be doing. So allowing for this, I mean, with the internet so easily available, in this 2 years that we sort of had to work from home, it sort of gives you an idea of perhaps, again, induce changes in the way we think of how we live, how we work. Those kind of ideas that come in that might transform the way we sort of, and then we actually operate on a daily basis. It might transform the way our cities are structured, it might transform the way our architecture is put together. So we can't say, there's so many factors that come in even from, way outside. Construction technology, I mean, steel, we all know the way it's sort of changed the way, what is possible with, with the kind of building we create. The whole thing about equipment, high-speed construction, the cost of doing something, and there's one impatient capital that is coming, which pushes the way architecture needs to be done on a yesterday basis. So you suddenly start thinking differently of how you want to put buildings together, prefab. 3D printing, now we really don't know where it's going to lead us. I mean, it's something that's already possible, but perhaps it's going to get cheaper and more easily available over time. And it's going to definitely transform the way we think of the way we put buildings together. Because all this is something that's going to, definitely affect us. Cultural and political changes, I mean, you have, sort of very top-heavy governments that are building up the state, and the kind of buildings that therefore emerge. You have perhaps, bottom social sort of leaning governments, welfare states that will then look at maybe social housing as the key projects that they are, that the societies sort of concentrate upon, and it changes the way, empathetic to non-empathetic architecture that comes into play in the social conscience. Aspirations of people, economic growth sort of induces that. Suddenly, you're looking at a richer nation with more money to spend. Everybody thinks that they need to have a car, they need to have. So again, the way it sort of induces transformation in the way architecture gets put out there. Gender and inclusivity. I mean, we were just discussing with friends, 20 years from now, there'll probably be, majority of architects in India are going to be female. They're going to be women. There are already more women in all the architecture, 450 colleges of architecture. Every single college, every single year in every single college is showing a majority of women in the classrooms. It's going to change in 20 years, right? So I think it will transform the way. So not only the people, women will be creating architecture. I think the clients will be more and more women receiving this. Bureaucrats. It's going to change. I mean, 20 years from now, perhaps they're going to completely have a different sort of discussion on it. Inclusivity of all kinds. I mean, and that's something I think it's even nice to see the Indian society sort of widening the way they appreciate and sort of are empathetic to everybody's sensibilities of things. So these are things that are obviously external factors that make architecture sort of get transformed. And then there's a transformation in architecture, where perhaps these external factors remain the same, and it's the game that the architect plays, in a response to perhaps specific context or a set of conditions, without the loss of identity or concept. So it's allowing for all these external factors perhaps remain the same. So the architect is then playing his own games of spatial transformation, or formal transformation, or metaphorical transformation. It's using dimensional or subtractive or additive sort of skills of just pure, basic design sort of games, where you can, transform the way the architecture develops. Very sort of decaying sort of So, I mean, for two examples I just picked out, just to reflect, sort of throw at the audience. One is from Alvar Alto's work. Over a series of, over decades, he did 4 libraries. If you look at the plan of the library, you can start recognizing elements, which are similar, but he kept, transforming them every time he does the project. And the resultant buildings are all completely different. So it's really interesting, just where he's within his own practice playing games. The other architect that I picked out is Anand Raje. Unfortunately, doesn't get discussed as much as perhaps he deserves. But if you look at again over time his plans, he's got this whole idea of the cuboids and the diagonal, and keeps playing with that. And and the resultants again are completely different. He just sort of emphasizing on this. So we just picked out very quickly, since I've got now maybe 90 seconds to go, 2 projects that we sort of had the opportunity to work in Bombay, where the city has transformed from an industrial sort of manufacturing city to perhaps a more services-oriented city. And so the old mills and the old docks and all that are all obviously going away. And you're actually seeing, for example, within the city, where the old mill areas are all getting flattened out, and real estate is being sort of, completely, stitched in blocks of glass, coming in. We actually had the opportunity, luckily for us, I think in the studio, good clients, convinced, where we actually built one of these projects is in Parel, which is the absolute mill area of Bombay, which is an old warehouse which somebody had converted into like a studio for MTV. It looked like a warehouse and it sort of retained. And we sort of actually started doing a study of all these surrounding context in Parel. Has got some really nice old buildings which doesn't get talked about in the South Bombay version of what heritage means. The old KEM hospital and stuff. So we started transforming this building and then sort of actually started using the similar sort of window transformations, the same stone, the same scales, trying to resist and then sort of completely converted the inside into almost like a public space that is parallel to the road outside, etc. And then just change the whole sort of warehouse into like a sort of a nice box where you have this tree in the courtyard kind of a office space. The other one was actually for Parle biscuits people. It's an old factory. This is like a 1940s sort of a drawing of their factory. This is like parallel to the railway tracks. And this was an old factory. They sort of don't manufacture any of the biscuits in Bombay anymore. They're everywhere else in the country. So that, they sort of luckily did not want to break their sheds and modernize their campus. So we actually used the old shed, which is like almost 85 years old, and converted that into sort of their now what is the party headquarters building. And so there was sort of very intricate sort of changes that were being made, and they transformed the whole thing into like a completely contemporary, but allowing for the inside to be still recognized as the old factory. In fact, keeping some of the boiler room spaces and their chimney spaces, and repurposing them. They are going to celebrate 100 years at the end of this decade. So this is something that we actually built this whole wall for them. So this was just very quickly. Thank you for bearing with me. I would sort of now invite Fahid to sort of continue our discussion on transformation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank RAF for this wonderful opportunity. And I think with that we'll get moving to our views. Okay. So transformation in architecture. Am I using this? So transformation in architecture, we have categorized that into different titles, and I'm straight getting to the point. First one possible approach is extending the life cycle of material. So I'm going to showcase three projects which we are working on, material and generic work. So this is the structure. I think the proportion is a little off, but yeah. Which we have done completely out of recyclable material. And so I went to the yard, looked at different materials. I found this bunch of mattress springs very exciting. UAE receives 100 mattresses every day as rubbish. And they have a very beautiful extraction facility where they separate the bed springs from the spring. And I think today most of the material what we are working with, it is how do I say, it is not this raw format. It is so processed that there are more in that side, be it a brick, be it anything. So at times, getting an opportunity to work on non-standard raw material for us is very exciting. So this is some of the initial sketches, some of the models which we made, some of the renders which we have submitted. So this was a very hands-on project because we had to go to the site and resolve issues then and there. So this is the final product. It is completely made of recycled bed springs. It had a lifespan of 7 days. So it comes from the yard, then it goes back to the yard, it's compacted, and today might be for some flour or so. So inside that, it posted different design products. That. It has some temporary partitions that can be repurposed. This is another project which we completed a few years back. The first to extending the life cycle of materials by reusing it. Now with new age commerce picking up, like the cashmere industry picked up and they have a lot of beds. So they are getting rid of the old terracotta roof tiles. So terracotta roof tiles either goes back as landfill or it's mostly landfill and no one wants it. So we got the entire roofing material. This is one of my sketches, which is really terrible because of the proportion. But yeah, with the precedence. So yeah, basically use the material as another layer of insulation for the wall. And we generally in our approach to work, we try to see that most of the wealth spent on project benefits the surrounding things rather than getting things from outside. We do end up taking things from outside. I'm not saying we don't, but we try and limit it. So for us, a good life is about living close to the ground and aspiring for the limitless. So I like this idea where it's a single-story house. Let's go back to the sketch. Predominantly, it's a single-story house where this is one wing with one bedroom, and that's another two-bedroom component connected to the courtyard. So the family, they're very open. They like people coming in. So they have neighbors who constantly visit, engage in conversations. So then there is I'm going to show you a video which transforms basically their life from their city life to when they shift into this house. So yeah, this is a common courtyard which connects both the wings. It's around 2,000 square feet. There are pets, animals, and so on and so forth. The Damachi of the house, she knows 4 languages. And this is about adaptive reuse. This is a project we're working on. It's an old church in the UK which is getting converted into a fine dining restaurant. Okay, so that's another approach. Then comes the transformation of massive initiative. It actually it completely revolutionized. There's another structure on there, and it completely revolutionized the concept of social housing. Today, most of the social housing is a stereotype fixed plan, but with this 3D printing, the complete way you approach a drawing, the complete way you experience a drawing, everything is going to change. And to make things even more complex, I'll say that the next one. Yeah, so that's our architecture, and we are working on a couple of projects which is the issue with 3D printing is still there are no uniform codes or standards. So unlike regular on the wall, so the specification part is a bit challenging. So we have to work with the university who validate the performance of the building. And this one, it's another structure obviously not done by us. It's, if I remember, it was in Amsterdam, which is completely made out of recycled plastic. So at one of the shows, some rock concert, they took the waste plastic glasses, recycled into small pellets, right there at the spot, and built furniture. So this completely going to revolutionize the way we work. And I'm not talking of future, I'm talking of present, what's happening. So this is the last one, which actually is a little scary. Which is the strengthening of metaverse. That's a virtual world. Zaha Hadid, Schumacher is heading this in a very, very big manner. I'm not getting into the other aspects of it, but oh, that's the last one. Okay, fine. So I showed, it is about slowness. Today we're all in a rush. Often when young architects come to our house, I ask them where is their love because you're always in a rush to do things and you just cannot rush. And I think this is a good example of slow living.
मेरे को बुखार जा रहा है और फिर लूलू देंगे तो फिर उसके बाद
There is an audio. I think it's starting to. There's no audio. It's called the silent house. Jaipur is the second generation. How much you use it? It's not only what you use paper. All the smaller things of life, but landscape, things living around you. How much should you passion? How much attention you pay? And it's life. So that's the two blocks that you see, and it's off grid. It's about fascinating about meeting people, spending time. It's absolutely often discover fact. So the grandfather had a habit of writing diaries. So the extracts from the diaries, that's his fun. Biology still suits our own lessons. The space for us is all about relationships, being connected, being grounded, yet aspiration. So they have their own pond, they do fishing, we go fishing there. They have our big ones.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Rajasthan Architecture Festival for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to Jaipur and Rajasthan. You know, it's sort of a paradise for architects, and it's always very inspirational for me when I visit this part of this country. You know, those were two fantastic presentations, and I think where I would sort of position myself, Sunil gave a sort of a larger picture, and I think there was a lot of focus on, you know, on the material aspect and also of slowness in Majid's presentation. And I think what I'm going to show you is something a little bit in between, and it's looking at, in one respect, conventional sort of elements of architecture, and this idea that, you know, when you talk about transformation, it implies both continuity as well as change, because obviously it's not something is transforming itself and becoming something else. So there is an aspect which is universal and lives through time, and there is the other part which is sort of context specific and adapts to different situations. So what I'll try to do is, you know, show through some examples of references, the kind of references that we have possibly consciously and unconsciously used in our practice, and the way in which you know, the reference itself is sort of used in a context which is very different from where it originally came from. So there are about any images help you with this? Yeah, so some of the, you know, looking back at our practice and some of these sort of influences, and I sort of try to, you know, look at certain aspects. You know, one is this idea of precinct and creating a sort of it's about placemaking and how one creates a sense of identity within a larger context. And then there's something about streets and, you know, we call, you know, multiple scales within a building, which is there in nested nooks. And then, of course, and something to do with the landscape. So the first and the last have to do with more to do with settlement patterns and sort of engaging with the landscape. And the other three are, you know, very architectural. So you know, an example of actually creating a space within a larger space. You know, and in this case, it's a kind of a separation. It's a sacred precinct, and what one is doing is, you know, doing this sort of separation between what is sacred and what is profane. And by creating this strong identity, which is a combination of the architecture as well as how it is enclosed, you sort of escape from the kind of a hustle and bustle of the city. And as you move through these kind of concentric layers, you come towards something which is more enigmatic, peaceful, and sort of spiritual. But there are also other kinds of examples, like for example in Rajasthan itself, you know, you have this idea of this little settlements in you know, towards the Barmer side, which I saw when I was traveling once, and the Dhanis, and these little clusters of houses which kind of you know, huddle together and create this sort of an enclosure, sort of a walled enclosure. Now in this case, it's providing sort of security, you know, so there is that secure sort of enclosure where people can live and sleep in the night, but also it's sort of creating a microclimate. You know? So by creating this little huddle, you protect from the hot winds, and you have planting within that creates this sort of an oasis. And so it's again creating a sort of a precinct or a sort of a space within a larger kind of a more harsh kind of climate, or a sort of a oasis within. So I mean, so we've sort of, we're working on a project in Shirohi in Rajasthan, and it's a school, and some of these thoughts were in the back of our mind, and we were really looking at, how do you sort of create a cluster of buildings in a, say, a 4-acre site. And so one of this, we have this idea, now, typically when you do an institutional project, you sort of deal with how do you deal with the edge of the property? How do you make it sort of disappear? Because there's something very, banal and about this compound wall which everybody wants, And then there's also all kinds of these utility elements, like there are roads, there's parking, there's utility structures which come as part of any campus plan. So what we did was we create this precinct within a precinct. So that pink layer which you see is a sort of a peripheral layer within which there's an inner precinct which is sort of pedestrian. And as you can see in that section, so when you sort of enter the inner precinct, you sort of, it's like a bowl which you sort of enter, and as your eye level goes lower, that peripheral sort of layer disappears, and what you're connecting with is actually the landscape beyond, which is the agricultural landscape and the hills in the distance. So this is sort of an example of really, an idea which is sort of taken from something which is quite different, examples which I showed you earlier, but applied in a very specific way, in a very practical solution for a sort of a master plan. And what this does is that when you remove all those elements like roads and parking and from the inner sanctum of the campus, you create this sort of slightly, so what you see is the architecture and then the landscape, so and that sort of connection which creates a strong sense of place, hopefully. Then of course, we've all been fascinated by streets, and this idea of, especially the experience of a street in an old city, traditional cities like Ahmedabad, we have so many examples in Rajasthan, Jaipur, and so this is something which, when you have that kind of experience, it stays within you and becomes part of your system. And there's a loss of that kind of experience in our cities today because of the kind of building typology and bylaws that we follow. So what you have is a domination of the vehicular space and a dispersal of buildings which become sort of objects. So there's this sort of loss of this experience, but within the kind of projects you work, sometimes try to recreate the whole experience of the street. So, this was actually, that is of course, again, examples from Rajasthan, Jaisalmer on the left. And a couple of months back, I was traveling in Rajasthan. I spent a couple of days in Bundi, which is just 2 hours from here. And it's a beautiful town. And what's also, so one is this street as a climatic element, as a social space, as a piece of architecture. But also, I think what I found interesting in Rajasthan was the relationship between settlements and the landscape. So there's always the settlement which is nestled in the hills, like Jaipur is an example, it's encircled by hills. Or you look at all these little towns which you see along the way, they're sort of in some way connected with the hills. And yeah, so Bundi is like that, and then you see, sometimes when you are in the street, you sort of see across and you see glimpses of the landscape. So there's this combination of this intensity of the urban experience as well as that release when you get a vista to the landscape. So this was one proposal that we ran for CMC Bangalore in Jaipur. This was with and there was a similar condition of a hill, and we sort of wrapped the entire hospital and residential sort of institutions around the hill with the main street and these kind of cross streets. So it's a sort of an adaptation again of an urban kind of fabric to an institutional sort of a solution, where the street and the idea of the street structures the master plan. But again, the combination of the red line, which is the intense urban sort of feel, with the cross axes which connect with the landscape. So they're kind of really like you have in the hill towns in Italy. Again, when you walk around the streets and you get those glimpses of the landscape. So this was when we were adding a floor to a building, and we deal with the corridor, and in modern practice, with the efficiencies required, the W corridor is something you can't escape. And so we were adding a floor to a building. This was in IIT, Bangalore. And so we added a top floor to this building. We created this sort of street which winds around, using it's an adaptation from the old structure. So a street that winds through and becomes a sort of interactive space between these incubation labs and the students with the classrooms. And then again, if you see those, there are these terraces that you sort of come across, which read out, and again. This idea of the scales within scales, you have this idea of a shrine within a shrine, and again from Havanahel, these beautiful multiple scales within a building. You have these larger scale of the palace, but you have a smaller scale of these little alcoves, which it's a wonderful play. And that's one, of course, example from the Miramars building in Ahmedabad. And then so this idea of a building within a building was explored in this healthcare center which we did in Dharmapuri. And this is again, it's a climatic solution. It's very hot climate and you create this shaded layer around the building. But what it also does is programmatically, the inner building is sort of placed asymmetrically and you get sort of a variety of verandas, waiting spaces for patients, public gathering space, the back corridors for doctors and the service area, and the cavity at the top is used to run services. Again, when you work with bylaws and, you get stuck with certain dimensions, like a 10 feet floor dimension, and staircase widths, which are determined by fire norms. So how do you escape from that? So one is that we that you have always your eye comes to things which are smaller than that standard and also larger. So it's a way of sort of moving away from that sort of standardized experience. And of course, a little pavilion extension to a house where there's a perforated box which allows nature to come in. But within that, there is a box which has multiple alcoves and rooms and screens which sort of open and close to allow differences in light, privacy, etc. And then, of course, the idea of facades themselves. And I'll just go through this quickly. So again, a fantastic example from the Havanahel. And this idea of the veranda, which again becomes like a climatic element, is also a social space. And we've used this use the idea of a veranda in a multi-story building where you have this outer skin, which is of these metal louvers, and inner facade. So it's basically a double skin facade which has varying depths, sometimes only level protection, but also become movement spaces and social spaces. And then of course another example here of these kind of facades where the compressed double layer facades with many kind of roles like security, climate protection, privacy, etc. And then last, I'll just take 30 seconds on this. It's this idea of settlements in a sort of a monsoon landscape, and the idea of raised mounds, Janapada, where you set, so where the people set literally, and which accompany these varying levels of of water during the monsoons. So this is actually close to Patna. And then of course you have, as a counter to the high mounds, you also have the pits, the ponds, the agricultural sort of tanks, and the sort of ponds which you see in Rajasthan also. But we're doing a major project there in Patna and waterlogged area. So it's basically divided into a high ground and low ground, with the building on the high ground and the sort of a park on the low ground. And what the park has is it actually accommodates varying levels of water. So it's sort of in the dry season, it's one level, and in the season of ponds, it's also in the water level, it's sort of rise. And in an extremely hot environment, you will still have that building, but the park will be flooded. So this is sort of mitigation strategy, which again, urban flood mitigation, but which again comes from this idea of a traditional practice. And then of course the landscape itself is developed along wet dry gradients, and so this whole thing about cultivation along those gradients. This drawing is by Anuradha Mathur. Okay, so, she is very unfortunate that she passed away, but she actually worked on this. It was a collaborative sort of project, and so this is an example at a level of how one occupies a monsoonal terrain. So that's it, yeah. So these are a couple of examples. But I think I just want to touch upon one point is that it's not necessarily a process that you have a sort of an inspiration or a reference and you move forward. It's actually sometimes the other way also. Sometimes you do something without thinking, but you find resonance in examples elsewhere. Thank you.
Where we sort of have general questions for all the speakers. So this whole idea of transformation, I mean, the fact is that we all know, if I show the last bit of slide about Asia as a continent, this continent is going to transform. I mean, it's going to be getting economically stronger. And the moment money comes in people's hands, their aspirations change. So how do we make sure that when you sort of, on one hand say, that you preserve heritage, there's a demand obviously for new buildings, and maybe cities being relooked at. So how do we preserve the DNA of our cities to ensure that this transformation sort of remains valid? I mean, from what I understand, from what I remember of biology, even if the caterpillar becomes a butterfly, the DNA doesn't change. So it can be completely physically transformed, but in essence it remains the same animal in the same state. But I mean, from what we are seeing today, in the way our cities are growing, it's not, it's just completely being, so I mean, anyone can pick up from what we see this as 5 to 20 years down the line. How do we see this moving forward?
Hello, yeah. I think it's always been a challenge for most countries to try and keep your heritage building because it never seems to be seen as development. As most countries develop, like you said, they want to build new buildings, and old buildings are not a good showcase. But I think we need to remember that we have to remember our past, alright? And the past buildings are not necessarily terrible buildings. In fact, they are very, very lovely. We need to find a new use for those buildings, alright, and restore them to glory. But like I said, it's difficult, alright, because most governments would like to move areas and they like to do development. And I believe that's where architects and planners come in. Because we have been trained, we have the foresight to see the possibilities and the potential of us using the cuisine. I think you spoke about the cuisine area, yours 4,000 years, I mean 200 years. But really, I think that the ability for us as architects to really campaign, and not just campaign among the converted, but really lobby your governments, lobby your government departments, and really put forward a master plan to help you preserve your heritage. I think that's what I felt that could be done.
I think that one aspect is quality. Okay? If something is of good quality, it lasts. And that's why sometimes these old buildings survive for such a long time. And I think it's interesting also what the kind of plans they have. But usually it's a very non-functional, it's the opposite of your bubble diagram functioning here. It's a building which can sort of adapt itself to multiple. So that's why it's very often sort of easier to adapt old buildings and modern ones to accommodate new programs. And so I think it's this aspect of quality lasts. And I think that it was, as somebody said, it's not good because it's old. It's old because it's good.
I think it's a major challenge, to strike a balance between how to maintain the old buildings and reuse them, and the growing population, land is not being, manufactured anymore. So, where do you take the call? The population is increasing, you need more land, land prices are going up. How do you reutilize the land that is there, and how you, not build, not destroy the heritage? So it's a major challenge. I don't think anybody can answer that question.
I mean, I think it's one of the challenges. Yes, I mean, we should not get, being pragmatic, too romantic about saying that we have to preserve everything. Of course, we should preserve it. But there is, it's an escapable thing about the pressure of, sort of because you have more requirements, and just your populations are growing, and all that sort of thing. So rebuilding or building new, but with the knowledge of what the old was, is, in my view, in a way, a link that needs to. It's not just about architects. Perhaps we need to perhaps be more, like Rita saying, government, and just gently be, educate clients, for them to appreciate the fact that there is perhaps, the requirement of, which is what I'm trying to say, that keeping the DNA, because you can't pretend that new redevelopment or new development is not going to happen. So suddenly, like say in India, we have this place now, say, Shanghai or Dubai, or the kind of cities. Yeah. So that's the whole point of where do you, because also the demand comes from impatient capital, as it's called. Clients come to a question to say, I want last meeting, and thank you for the sponsor of this event that we see a lot of last meetings at the beginning. So you can't pretend that that's not going to happen. Keep the balance without getting too romantic either way.
So my point is, I think we look at the buildings, not necessarily on its own. I think we do not need to look at our heritage building necessarily on its own. Alright, even in a small building, you look at it in a collective whole. If you are looking at development of the city, for example, you could make that building as part and parcel of a program that fits the city. I mean, the worst thing that an architect will do is say, I have an old building and I want to build a hospital within it. You know, hospital requirement will never be able to fit within a carcass like an old building. So therefore, we need to creatively think outside the box. Can I find another piece of land adjacent to it? I build a hospital, and this could be a program to refit the old building such that it could be a place where they meet patients. It could be a public front of the hospital. I'm just saying that out of the fact that we are looking at the context of the development as a whole, do not necessarily restrict our view of the old building to what is purpose that was built before. So maybe that is an angle to look at. Yeah.
So I just want to add something here. My house in the same present, my dad's house. So it was my dad, two brothers, and a sister. So that house was an ancestral house. Now, when the family grew, the house remained the same. You know, we expand on that. So, of course, my dad started buying all of them, and he maintained the house. But it becomes such a challenge. Now, today when I take my kids out there, they're not ready to stay there because what happens is you don't have air conditioning, you don't have heaters. So we just put in, some kind of a, retrofit we're doing and we're using it. But it's a big challenge using that house. So, there's no answer to it. How do you use it? So we are trying our best. We put in some, air conditioning, but where do you place the air conditioning? It's a big problem. Sanitation has been introduced, everything is there, but I don't know where to answer it. It's very nice, it's like a museum, it's a beautiful house, but it's not easy.
I just read quickly, I've been told we're running out of time. Anybody in the audience would sort of want to Yatin? Well,
exciting presentation. Okay, I would like to ask perhaps our immediate president of Agency Rita and also Samuel. We have seen you guys as a leader in architecture, talking about architecture transformation. What do you think is the most critical thing that we should pass on to our future architects? What do you think should be the most critical part that we should change or add into curriculum? Especially you have just talked about maybe how to think out of the box or whatever factors that change every day. So maybe I would like to hear from your opinion. Thank you very much.
Really interesting question. I don't know whether everybody heard us. What can be introduced in the curriculums in the schools, which can perhaps is that right? So that we can probably the awareness increases and the sort of empathy increases for this sort of thing.
I'm not an authority on ancient architecture. I think, but my point is that I think many of our buildings that was built many years ago has got very basic general principles of science part of it. I mentioned I was here in Jaipur some years ago. I went to the Emerald Palace, and I was just sharing the way it's, the corridor is dark, and then they have this mirror that was fractured and they embedded on the wall, and every little alcove, maybe about 3 meters down, you have a little candle. So it's amazing that by lighting the candle, you kind of light up the entire corridor, entire tunnel. So to me, those basic principles, I would say, it's like more vernacular wisdom. Our ancestors have tried and trusted many of this so-called building science that we talk about. Now projecting, like in my country called the Green Rating Tools Green Mark. You have the LEED program and all that. It's just that we have never verbalized those concepts in our ancient architecture. But the principles are very much embedded in our old architecture. So my point is, as part of Asian architectural fraternity, we should go into digging out of this vernacular wisdom and perhaps let our students understand that these principles can be employed even in the current modern architecture. That's what I want to say.
There's one fear that I sort of have. There's the problem of plenty versus necessity being a model of invention. Perhaps, all those years ago, we were constrained with technology, or purely like in India, your first 50 odd years, we perhaps had no money. So a lot of this inventiveness, sort of, you had to be inventive to find solutions. Whether it was the old sort of even public buildings in India, or 200 years ago where you didn't have electricity, but you had sort of this palace to light up, and people. So now there perhaps is a problem of plenty. You suddenly can get everything. So how do you put this balance, and where do you how do you tell people that you should not, for example, have a swanky fancy building? It's very difficult for you to today. Perhaps 50 years ago you would have the money to afford it at all. So now it's the challenge which, when you say how do you teach students, it's like trying to tell students, initially we used to all be told to learn to sharpen a pencil. Today the guy says, why should I use a pencil? I'm going to go on the software straight away. So that's the whole point. I'm trying to say, how do you sort of keep this balance between this, and what's available?
I think, I'm assuming there are quite a lot of students attending this program. I think there are two key things. Number one, when you enroll for an architecture program, it's not necessarily you need to sit and do design buildings for a living. There are plenty of options which an architecture program exposes you to. So be aware of it, be conscious of it. Design is not the only task. The end goal of an architecture program is number one. Studying in Darbar, studying in Bangalore, I had an opportunity to work with Ditya Venkatesh. She used to teach theory of architecture. It was an elective. She taught a group of us how to read an architectural criticism, and a beautiful exercise. So the options are phenomenal, that's number one. And for the rest who choose to pursue architecture with the love of God, do it with compassion, do it with love. You're going to spend your lifetime on it. So yeah.
Simply first
hospitality. I think let's teach students to take an informed decision. So, binary, and this is what I was about to just bring about that, cities have always grown, increased, we've built more and more, but is it suddenly the planet has changed in just last 20 years that we feel there's a disjunct? If you see old Jaipur, old Ahmedabad, we invented wonderful typology called row houses, which was a good adaptation of bungalow and a traditional row house. We achieved the same density. Even old city has 2.7 FSI, which even legally, except for exceptional building in Ahmedabad, we don't have. So to think that there's suddenly a need for more different typology, I'm not too sure. It's probably, like you said, the liberty that we have taken to just bring in for a high something that not necessarily one was called for, and second, now that perpetuates. But I'm very sure as a fashion is also going to fade out. Sometimes something new catches your attention. But how many of some of these so-called new buildings we look for even a third time? So if we go to the basics, roots, and understand what is the true DNA, that need not be flouted. We have a good study of where actually, Ahmedabad, till that ring road, you don't see really that disjunct, and it's been just last 15 or 18 years. And now suddenly on the other side of the outskirts, should be actually low rise, is now always the high rise. So city has grown 70 kilometers, and yet it is now going vertical. So we have not achieved either of it, neither a compact city nor a kind of sprawled out bungalow. So I think that's where somewhere we need to have that kind of a study analysis to really understand how much of more is really required and what is the best way that to achieve that. I see that 2.5, 2.7 FSI very achievable with low height, high density, with terraces and all that. Actually, we should not question the new building to build, but to take a liberty, there's no outdoor space, no community sense between the neighbors. So I think it's that quality of life that old cities or previous built form had, has our new building brought that. So I think that's the real question.
So on that note, thank you for completely out of time. Can I take one question? Are we done? Okay, done. I will listen to the lady. Oh.
Hi, this is Ashutosh. I just want to share a concern with the speakers. Hardly 500 meters from this hotel, there is a building, probably largest in Jaipur, which flouts all the norms. It flouts the context, it flouts the climate, it flouts whatever we are looking at the Rajasthan architecture. And this is probably the biggest building of Jaipur. What should be done when the buildings like this come up? And the society looks up to these buildings as a sign of success, probably.
That's the point I was making. I mean, perhaps we need to get on our feet. I think Habib said something references of all this earlier, that we need to stop being in silos, architects talking to architects, with that much so that we can move ahead. As we need to go out into the public domain and talk to people who take those decisions and try and figure out, because it's not something for, you can't go on hold of Dharna in front of that. The whole city will laugh. They don't understand why you don't like this building that they all love. So we've got to perhaps be able to educate them through our own means, the IIA, council or whatever, of being able to do this. We've got to do the outreach ourselves. Otherwise we're irrelevant. We're just making ourselves more and more irrelevant. Nobody calls an architect on TV or an interview on the panel. If there's a problem with urban something in the city, nobody calls an architect for it. So it's something that probably we are making ourselves irrelevant. Stand up for what we should be doing. So anyway, on that note, thank you everybody. Thank you everyone.
To present a small token of gratitude, may I please invite Architect Amit Gahlot and Architect Rajendra Puri on stage to felicitate our speakers for the session. Thank you everyone.